I was driving down a narrow, winding dirt road deep in the Appalachian backwoods, the kind of road that feels like it hasn't seen a vehicle in decades. The sun had dipped behind the hills, and the forest around me had darkened into a suffocating black. My headlights cut narrow slices of light into the trees, but the shadows beyond them seemed unnaturally still, almost waiting. I'd been making this drive countless times, trying to reach a friend's cabin for the weekend, but something felt off this night, like the air itself was holding its breath. The usual sounds of the woods, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, had vanished. It was dead quiet, save for the soft hum of my engine and the tires crunching over loose gravel. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, tired eyes playing tricks on me. But then I noticed movement along the edge of the tree lane, figures slipping behind the thick trunks, just out of the reach of my headlights. I slowed down, heart thumping, trying to catch a clear look, but every time I blinked, the figures seemed to vanish, as though they melted into the forest itself. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was deer, or maybe other hikers, though at this hour and in this part of the mountains, that didn't make much sense. The road twisted again, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, eyes scanning every shadow. Minutes later, the forest opened into a small clearing I hadn't noticed on any map. And there, in the middle of the clearing, a fire burned, bright and flickering. Around it, a group of people moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm, chanting in voices that were almost musical but carried an edge that made my stomach knot. Their faces were hidden beneath crude masks, and their movements were hypnotic, fluid yet predatory, like wolves circling their prey. I froze behind the wheel, unsure if I should get out, turn around, or pretend I hadn't seen anything. The wind shifted and carried their whispers directly toward me, sharp and unmistakable, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I thought of retreating quietly, trying to back my car without drawing attention, but as I shifted into reverse, my foot caught a rock buried in the gravel. The crunch echoed across the clearing, cutting through the chanting. Every head turned simultaneously, eyes, though hidden behind masks, seeming to pierce right through me. I panicked, slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning against the gravel, and the engine roared as the forest raced past in a blur. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, heart hammering, sweat slicking my palms and back. Even then, I felt it, eyes on me, watching, patient. I tried to convince myself it was just an abandoned cult, a group of locals practicing some forgotten ritual. But there was something more, something deeply rooted in the forest, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every rustle in the leaves, every creak of a branch in the wind, sent me spinning, expecting to see the masked figures again. I kept replaying the moment when the chanting stopped just long enough to hear my name whispered, soft and deliberate, carried on the wind. I still can't explain it. I don't know how they knew it, or if my mind is playing tricks on me. The memory of that night has haunted me in ways I never thought possible. Driving home along familiar roads, I'd see movement in the shadows, figures that didn't belong, always just on the edge of perception. I stopped going to that part of the mountains entirely, but the sense of dread never left. I started hearing whispers in the quiet of my apartment, the same low, rhythmic tone of the chanting, as if the forest itself was breathing in my ears. Friends tell me I'm imagining it, that the isolation and stress are messing with my head. Maybe they're right. But then why, in every dream, every foggy morning when the world is quiet, do I see the fire and the masks and hear my name being called? I tried to research the clearing, thinking maybe it was a known site for some local folklore, a forgotten cult, or even a secret society. Nothing came up, not in local records, newspapers, or online forums. It's as if the place doesn't exist, or refuses to be found by anyone who isn't already inside it. I even tried going back, following the same road I took that night, but the path seems different. The trees close in tighter, the dirt road twists in ways I don't remember, and after a while, I always find myself at a bend I don't recognize, feeling eyes on me once again. The more I think about it, the more I realize it wasn't just the people, or the chanting, or even the fire. It was the way the forest itself seemed alive, aware, protective of the clearing. It pressed against me, whispering, warning, daring me to enter and daring me to flee. And the masks, they weren't just hiding faces, they were hiding intentions, hiding knowledge of things I'm not sure I want to understand. Every time I close my eyes, I see them moving around the fire, their shadows stretching impossibly long, their whispers curling around the edges of my mind. I've told a few people about it, friends who've hiked in those mountains. Some nod politely, others laugh, say it's just superstition, some prank, some isolated ritual. But there's a tight knot in my chest that tells me they don't understand. You don't just stumble into a place like that and walk away untouched. Something marks you, something that follows. I've tried to fill my days to keep busy, but quiet nights are the worst. That's when the forest returns. The stillness, the waiting, the feeling that eyes are scanning my apartment, my yard, my car. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear chanting outside my window, soft and rhythmic, carrying a single word I cannot escape: my name. I've considered moving, leaving the state entirely, but part of me fears it won't matter. You can't outrun the memory. It's lodged inside your mind, woven into your nerves. Even typing this now, I feel the weight of those masked eyes, the heat of the fire, the cold wind brushing my face. I think about what might have happened if I hadn't noticed the rock under my foot, if I'd stayed frozen too long, if the chanting had turned toward me instead of fading into the night. And I shiver because part of me knows I will never find out, and part of me is terrified to try. I still drive roads at night, but I avoid backwoods paths now. My friends notice I flinch at shadows in the forest, at sounds out of place. I tell them it's nerves or tiredness, but deep down I know better. That clearing, the fire, the chanting, and the figures with masked faces aren't just a story. They are a place that exists outside of normal maps, outside of normal time, outside of understanding. And they know me. I hear my name sometimes, whispered in the wind, and I know that when the quiet comes, they are near, waiting, always watching, just beyond the reach of the light. The forest has a way of staying with you, long after you leave it. And some nights, when the road is empty and the wind carries a strange rhythm through the trees, I can swear I hear footsteps behind me, and I know I'm not alone. This is a glimpse into that night, and into the lingering dread that never lets me forget. The night I drove into the whispering woods, and something very real and very patient learned my name. It was early October when I decided to hike up Pine Ridge alone. I'd been going through a rough stretch. Work, family, everything felt like noise pressing in from all sides, and I thought a few quiet days in the Appalachians might clear my head. The trail wasn't marked well, but I'd been hiking long enough to trust my compass and my instincts. The first few miles were easy enough, just the crunch of leaves under my boots, the smell of damp pine, and the low hum of wind moving through the trees. But as the day stretched on, the sky dimmed faster than I expected. A fog rolled in, thick and pale, swallowing the ridges and trees until everything felt smaller, closer. The forest went quiet in a way I'd never heard before. It wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. By the time I realized I'd strayed from the main trail, the fog had deepened to a dull gray wall. I could barely see 10 feet ahead. My compass needle twitched uncertainly, like it didn't want to settle. I started feeling uneasy, but I told myself I'd find higher ground and reorient from there. Then, through the shifting mist, I saw it, an outline just barely visible between two leaning pines. A cabin. It was small, old, looked like it had been there for decades. The roof sagged in the middle, and moss crept up the sides of the logs like the forest was trying to reclaim it. The door hung slightly open, swinging with a soft creak each time the wind shifted. I called out, more out of politeness than expectation. No answer. The silence felt thick. Against my better judgment, I stepped up onto the warped porch. The boards groaned beneath my boots and I could smell something faint. Smoke and something sharper, almost metallic. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The first thing I noticed were the candles. Dozens of them melted down to twisted lumps on the floor and along the windowsills. Some were still smoldering faintly, thin trails of gray smoke curling toward the ceiling. My stomach tightened. Whoever had been here hadn't been gone long. On the walls, strange symbols were carved deep into the wood. Circles within circles, lines radiating out like spiderwebs, and small, crude figures that looked almost human. There were feathers, bones, bits of twine hanging from nails. It looked like some kind of ritual had taken place, though I didn't recognize any of it. A table sat in the center of the single room, its surface covered in melted wax and something dark that had dried in uneven streaks. I found a journal resting on top of it. The cover was cracked, the pages warped from moisture. I hesitated before opening it, half expecting to find it blank, but it wasn't. The handwriting was frantic, uneven, words overlapping in places as if written in panic. The entries spoke of devotion, of purification, of those who watch from the tree line. The later pages grew more erratic, the sentences breaking off mid-thought. One line repeated over and over. They see who looks. They come when named. A cold draft swept through the cabin, snuffing out what little warmth remained in the air. I set the journal down and turned toward the door. The mist outside had thickened to the point I could barely see the edge of the porch. I told myself I'd just stumbled across someone's strange hobby, some local group or hermit with a fascination for the occult. But as I stepped out, I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps behind me. I froze. The sound came again, deliberate and heavy, the kind of sound a person makes when trying not to be heard. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing but fog and shadows. I tried calling out, "Hello," but the word fell flat, swallowed by the mist. No echo. No answer. I told myself it was an animal and started walking back toward where I thought the trail was. The footsteps followed, just out of sync with my own. The forest around Pine Ridge is dense, old-growth pine that blocks most of the light, and in fog it feels endless. I could barely tell if I was walking in circles. Every few minutes I'd hear the soft crack of a branch, or the whisper of leaves shifting when the air was still. My chest tightened. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone step out from the mist. But it never happened. Just that steady feeling of being watched. Close, curious, patient. By the time the fog began to thin, I was exhausted. My phone battery had died hours earlier, and I hadn't seen a trail marker in at least 5 miles. But when the mist finally lifted a little, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The trees around me were marked, the same symbols from the cabin, carved deep into their bark, each one facing inward, forming a rough circle. I hadn't walked away from the cabin. I'd been walking deeper into something else. That's when I saw movement, barely visible through the haze. Figures, standing still between the trees, too far to make out clearly, but definitely human. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood, half shrouded by fog. I felt my knees go weak. My instincts screamed to run, but something told me that running would only make it worse. I backed away slowly, eyes fixed on them, but no matter which direction I turned, there were more shapes emerging from the mist, silent and unmoving. I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. I know I ran, branches tearing at my arms and face. I tripped, fell, scrambled back up. The woods felt endless, like I was running in place. The mist seemed to thicken again, and somewhere behind me, I heard the faint murmur of voices, low, rhythmic, like the chanting of many people all speaking in unison. The sound rose and fell with the wind, growing louder when I stumbled, softer when I froze. It followed me until I burst out onto a gravel road I didn't recognize. I don't know how long I stood there panting, staring back at the wall of fog. The chanting had stopped. The forest was still again, utterly silent. I walked until I found a ranger station at dawn. They said I must have wandered off a side trail. I didn't mention the cabin. When they offered to send a team to look, I told them to forget it. I couldn't explain the way that place made me feel, the way it felt alive, aware. It's been months since that day. I haven't been back to the mountains. But some nights when I can't sleep, I pull out the small scrap of paper I didn't realize I'd taken with me until days later. It must have been stuck to my jacket from the cabin. It's torn from the journal, one edge burnt. On it, scrawled in that same frantic handwriting, are 3 words. You looked first. I tell myself it's nothing, that it's just my mind trying to fill the gaps of what happened out there. But lately, when I walk home from work at night, I've started to notice movement in the corner of my eye, shapes that vanish when I turn to look. Sometimes I hear that same faint crunch of footsteps behind me, perfectly matching my pace. I tell myself it's coincidence, that I left the woods behind. But deep down, I know the truth. You don't just stumble upon a place like that and leave untouched. The cabin, the fog, the symbols, they weren't meant to be found. I stepped into something older than memory, and I think somehow it followed me back. I still dream about Pine Ridge. In the dreams, the mist never clears, and I can see the cabin ahead. Door open just a crack, smoke curling from within. I always wake before I reach it. But lately, I've started to hear whispers coming from that open door. Soft, pleading, familiar. And when I wake, my window's open, and the night outside smells faintly of burning wax and pine. I'd never planned to go as far as I did that night. I'd been hiking along a narrow ridge that ran parallel to an old creek bed, the kind that looked like it hadn't seen anyone in years. The sun had gone down faster than I'd expected, and the light that remained had that strange silver-blue tint that only appears right before full darkness. The air felt heavy, too still for the hour, and the only sound was the quiet trickle of water winding its way through the rocks below. I remember thinking I should turn back before I lost the trail entirely, but there was something about the way the moonlight hit the valley ahead that drew me in, like I was being led somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. I followed the creek deeper into the hollow. The further I went, the quieter everything became. The insects had stopped chirping, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Even the sound of my boots against the wet ground felt muffled. The trees grew taller and tighter the deeper I went. Their branches tangled overhead until only thin streaks of moonlight filtered through. It felt like stepping into another world, one that didn't belong to daylight. That's when I saw it. The trees opened into a clearing I hadn't seen marked on any map. The grass there was flat, matted down in a perfect circle, and at the center stood a large stone altar, half buried in moss. Around it, maybe a dozen people knelt in a ring, their heads bowed. The moon hung low, pouring cold light over them, and for a moment I thought I'd stumbled onto some kind of reenactment or spiritual gathering. But then I heard the chanting. It was low at first, barely a murmur, but as my ears adjusted I could hear the pattern. The words didn't sound like English. Each syllable rose and fell in a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost calculated, like the sound itself had weight. My chest tightened. I couldn't look away. Their voices blended into something that felt both human and wrong, like an old melody remembered too many times, losing its shape. I should have turned and left right then, but I didn't. Something about that sound held me in place, and before I knew it, I'd taken a few steps closer. I could make out details now. The people were barefoot, dressed in dark, rough clothing, their hands pressed to the dirt. No one moved except for the smallest swaying motion, back and forth, in rhythm with the chant. Their faces were turned slightly toward the altar, and I could see faint carvings on the stone surface, lines that caught the moonlight like they'd been freshly cut. I crouched behind a fallen log, trying to convince myself to leave, but my curiosity outweighed my sense. I wanted to know what they were saying, what they were doing out here so deep in the woods. That's when I noticed something off about the circle. The chanting didn't just echo, it seemed to bend around me like I was inside the sound, part of it. My skin prickled, and a strange pressure built behind my eyes, like the sound itself was pushing against my skull. Then, without warning, one of them stopped. The voice faltered mid-syllable, breaking the rhythm. Another stopped, then another, until the entire clearing fell silent. I thought maybe they'd heard me. My body went rigid. Breath caught halfway in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes darting between them. For a few seconds, no one moved. The forest seemed to fold inward on itself, thick with waiting. Then, slowly, every head turned, not toward the altar but toward the tree lane. Toward me. I ducked down behind the log, heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't dare breathe. I told myself they couldn't have seen me, that the moonlight hadn't reached this far. But then I heard it, a single footstep in the grass, then another. Soft. Deliberate. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe someone had gone to investigate a sound. But when I peeked through the gap in the log, I saw the space around the altar was empty. The circle was gone. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't tell where to go. The fog had crept back in, thin at first, then thick enough to blur the edges of the clearing. Shapes moved in the mist, just barely visible. They weren't rushing toward me. They were spreading out, silent, methodical, surrounding me. I backed away, slow at first, then faster. A twig snapped somewhere to my right, followed by another behind me. My breath came in short bursts. I couldn't tell how many there were or how close they'd gotten, but I knew I was being driven, herded toward the clearing. The mist seemed to pulse with every step I took, each breath turning the air colder. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my arms and face as I pushed through the undergrowth. I could hear movement all around me. Footsteps too light to be animals, too controlled to be chance. I didn't look back. The chanting had returned, faint but constant, threading through the woods like a current. It was everywhere at once, rising and falling, drawing me in no matter how far I tried to run. At some point, the ground gave way beneath me. I stumbled down a slope, crashing into the creek bed. The cold water soaked through my jeans, but I didn't care. I followed it downstream, slipping over rocks, half blind in the moonlight. The sound of the chant faded for a moment, then returned from ahead of me. I stopped, chest heaving, and realized the forest had gone silent again. Something moved on the ridge above the creek, a shadow, tall and narrow. Then another appeared on the opposite side. My pulse roared in my ears. I scrambled up the bank and forced my legs to move, though they felt like lead. The mist was thicker here, and the moon had vanished behind clouds. I could only see a few feet in front of me, and every direction looked the same. The chanting grew louder again, closer this time, coming from all sides. I tried to yell for help, but my voice cracked and died in my throat. Ahead, through the fog, I saw light, pale and flickering. I ran toward it, thinking it might be a campfire or a cabin. But when I broke through the last line of trees, I realized where I was. The clearing. The altar stood before me, its carvings glistening with something wet. The ground around it was churned up, the grass flattened as if from many feet. I could see shapes moving at the edge of the clearing, stepping out from the mist one by one. They formed a loose circle again, closing in around me. I stumbled backward, my boot catching on a root, and hit the ground hard. For a long moment, no one moved. The chanting had stopped again, replaced by the quiet rush of wind through the trees. Then one of them stepped forward. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a person tall, shrouded in something dark. Their hands were clasped together, and they tilted their heads slightly, almost curious. The others followed, moving closer in perfect silence. I backed away until I felt the rough edge of the altar against my palms. The carvings beneath my fingers were shallow but sharp. I don't remember much after that. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat, the way the air seemed to hum, and the faint warmth coming from the stone at my back. Then I was running again, crashing through brush and thorns, the forest tearing at my clothes. The chanting rose behind me, louder this time, no longer rhythmic but wild, chaotic, like the forest itself was screaming. I didn't stop until I hit the road, a strip of cracked asphalt shining pale under the moonlight. I collapsed there, half mad with exhaustion, waiting for headlights that never came. When the world finally grew quiet again, I could still hear them in the distance, their voices fading into the trees. It's been months now, but I can't forget that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see the circle, those kneeling figures bathed in moonlight, the altar waiting. Sometimes I dream I'm back there, standing at the edge of the clearing, unable to move. The chanting begins, soft and familiar, and I feel the pull again. Lately, I've started hearing it when I'm awake. I'll be walking near the woods behind my house, and I'll catch the faintest echo of voices, whispering just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I noticed something worse. Each time I hear it, the sound is a little closer. I don't go out at night anymore. I keep my curtains closed, but sometimes I catch a glint of light from the woods, a pale shimmer that looks too much like moonlight on stone. I try not to look, because part of me knows that the circle never really broke. It's waiting somewhere out there in the hollow, just beyond where the light reaches, waiting for me to come back and finish what I interrupted. And some nights, when the wind moves just right, I swear I can hear them again. Their chant low and steady, a rhythm that feels almost like breathing. I tell myself it's just the creek, just the forest shifting in the dark. But deep down, I know better. The circle remembers, and it's calling me home. I'd planned this trip for weeks, a simple weekend escape to clear my head. The ridge near my campsite had been recommended by an old friend who swore it was quiet, far from the usual weekend hikers, and perfect for someone looking to get lost in the woods for a while. I carried only the essentials: a tent, a small stove, some food, and my camera. The sun had been low on the horizon when I set out, brushing the tops of the pines with amber light, the kind of golden glow that feels almost sacred in the mountains. I liked hiking late in the day. It gave me a sense of moving into another world, one untouched by traffic, cell phones, or the hum of electricity. By the time I reached the ridge, the forest was settling into dusk. Shadows stretched across the trail, and the wind carried the faint, earthy scent of damp leaves and pine sap. The ridge overlooked a small valley, the kind that disappeared into rolling hills and thick stands of trees. I picked a spot for my tent on the flatter ground, tucked against a stand of pines for windbreak, and started to set up. The sky was fading fast, a deep purple bleeding into the horizon, and the first stars had begun to appear. I always enjoy watching nights settle over the mountains. It feels like the world is exhaling, slowing down to a rhythm only the forest can keep. That's when the fog rolled in. At first, it was just a pale haze, curling along the slopes of the ridge. But within minutes it thickened, settling into every dip and hollow like spilled milk. Soon I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The forest transformed instantly, familiar shapes turning into gray, indistinct blobs. The trail I had just walked seemed gone, swallowed by the mist. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself I'd done plenty of night hikes and fog was nothing to worry about. I checked my compass and GPS. Both worked, but the fog had a way of making everything feel off-kilter, and my confidence began to fray. I started to pack up my stove and gear, thinking I'd make camp somewhere closer to the main trail where I could see clearly. As I moved back toward the tent, I noticed something strange. In the thick gray of the fog, faint points of light glimmered, warm, flickering like candle flames. My stomach tightened. At first, I thought it might be other campers, someone else foolish enough to be out in this fog at night. I called out softly, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice sounded alien in the mist, muted and swallowed before it could reach anything. No answer. I took a cautious step forward, and the lights, tiny, wavering golden glimmers, grew clearer. And then I saw them. Dozens of faces, pale and faintly luminous in the fog, each holding a candle. They were scattered along the ridge, moving just enough to stay visible through the haze, but they didn't speak. They didn't advance. They simply stood or knelt, watching. Their eyes were unmistakable, alive with an awareness that made my chest constrict. I froze, unable to breathe. The wind shifted, carrying a soft murmur, almost like whispered words threading through the trees. My skin crawled. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figures didn't move toward me, but they were everywhere I looked. As I tried to orient myself, they began to vanish one by one, melting back into the fog as if the mist itself was swallowing them. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I felt exposed, the way a rabbit feels when it realizes the hawk is circling unseen. Each vanishing figure left an emptiness, a dark space in the fog that made my mind race. I realized then I had no idea where the main trail was, no clue how far I was from safety, and the fog had made the world a maze I could barely comprehend. The whispers grew louder, or perhaps I imagined it. I can't be sure. Words I didn't recognize tickled at the edges of comprehension, soft and deliberate, almost curling into syllables I half understood. They weren't calling me, not exactly, but they were there, watching, testing, lingering. I stumbled backward over roots, my hands clutching at trees for balance, and that's when I saw movement just at the edge of the fog. A single face appeared, not glowing this time, but solid and human enough to terrify me. It looked at me, and I swear it tilted its head in a way that felt intelligent, curious, predatory. I ran then blindly, crashing through low branches and thick undergrowth. The candlelit faces seemed to follow me through the mist, flitting from tree to tree, always at the edge of my vision. The forest floor rose and fell like waves, roots and rocks snagging my boots, tearing at my clothes, scratching my arms and legs. Every step was agony, but every step was necessary. I didn't stop to look back, but I knew the eyes were there. The whispers followed me, weaving into the wind like threads of cold silk brushing my ears. At some point, I lost the ridge entirely. The fog had thickened into a solid gray wall. I stumbled down a small incline, nearly falling into a hidden gully. My flashlight, which I hadn't turned on until now, barely pierced the haze, just enough to see wet leaves and slick roots beneath me. And that's when I heard the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps behind me. They weren't fast, they didn't need to be, but they were following, careful, precise, relentless. My mind raced, trying to figure out if I should hide, run, or call out. Every instinct screamed to run, but my feet felt glued to the earth. I tripped again, hands scraping along damp soil. When I pulled myself upright, I thought I glimpsed shapes moving in the fog. More candlelit faces, not just watching now but drifting, almost floating toward me. The air had grown thick, heavy with the smell of melted wax and damp earth. I gagged, swallowing hard, trying to catch my breath. The mist pressed against my face, filling my lungs, and I realized with horror that the world around me wasn't just fog. It was a barrier, a theater in which I had been placed, one in which I was the audience and the prey at the same time. Somewhere ahead, I spotted a faint glimmer of firelight, warm and steady. I ran toward it, hoping for human company, someone normal, someone real. But when I reached it, I realized there was no campfire, no warmth, just a stone circle, candles burned down into black stubs, and shadows moving within the fog like they had been waiting for me all along. I stumbled back, the candlelight flickering in shapes I didn't want to see. Faces, human but wrong, watching, unblinking. They didn't speak. They didn't move toward me. But their presence was a weight, pressing on my mind, filling me with an emptiness I can't describe. I turned and ran again, the whispers following, voices threading through the wind, rising and falling like waves. The branches tore at me, thorns cut into my hands and face, but I didn't care. I only cared about leaving. Eventually, after what felt like hours but may have been minutes, I saw the ridge drop into a familiar clearing. I didn't stop until my boots hit the flattened ground where I had set up my tent hours earlier. The candlelit faces were gone, the fog thinning just enough to let me breathe. My hands shook as I tore down the campsite, stuffing my gear into my pack with frantic haste. By the time I reached the car, the first hints of dawn were brushing the horizon. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was far from the ridge, driving down empty backroads, trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the fog, a product of exhaustion. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of those faces, glowing faintly in the mist, unblinking, patient. On foggy nights, when the wind presses through the pines just right, I swear I can see them standing in the distance, watching, waiting. I've told a few friends what happened. Some nod politely, others laugh it off. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, the way mountains can play with perception. Maybe it was a group of campers or a local ritual I stumbled upon. But deep down, I know it was something else. Something patient, something that doesn't need to move to hold you in its presence. I can still feel the weight of their gaze when I close my eyes. I can still hear the whispers threading through the fog, brushing my ears, reminding me that the ridge, the hollow, the stone circle, and those candlelit faces are out there, always waiting, patient and aware. I haven't gone back, and I don't plan to. But the memory won't leave me. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in around my own home, I can swear I see the faintest flicker of candlelight in the trees. I hold my breath, willing it to be imagination, yet knowing in my gut that it's not. It's always watching, always waiting. And somewhere, deep in the mountains, in the places the mist clings to most stubbornly, those eyes remain, unblinking, patient, and hungry for another witness. The forest is quiet tonight, too quiet, and I know that if I step outside, if I follow the path of fog, I'll see them again. Those faces, glowing in the mist, each candle a promise and a warning. And I know, as I always have, that I will never truly be free of that ridge, or that fog, or the patient eyes waiting silently, just beyond the reach of the light. I wandered into Elder Hollow on a crisp autumn morning, thinking it would be a quiet hike, the kind that lets your mind drift and your lungs fill with cold mountain air. The trail twisted and dipped along the ridges, lined with towering oaks and maples shedding their leaves in colors that made the forest floor glow like fire. Birds called lazily overhead, and the occasional breeze rattled the dead leaves. But for the most part, the hollow was silent, holding its breath like it had something to keep hidden. I'd heard tales of the valley before. Locals whispered about strange happenings, old rituals, voices in the fog. But I dismissed them as folklore, the kind of stories people tell to keep others off the trails. As I descended toward a small stream winding through the hollow, I heard it. Faint at first, almost drowned out by the trickle of water and the occasional bird call. A soft, melodic singing, so delicate it felt like it belonged to the mist rather than the trees. My heart picked up, curiosity prying at me. I paused, letting the sound wrap around me, and it seemed to move through the forest, drawing me forward. The notes were strange, disjointed in a way I couldn't place, almost hypnotic. I found myself moving downhill, slipping over wet leaves and tangled roots, following the ethereal harmony that seemed too perfect to be real. The hollow opened into a wide, grassy valley, shrouded in a thin fog that clung low to the ground. At the center, a group of people knelt or stood in small clusters, lanterns casting flickering orange light over their faces. Their mouths moved in synchronized rhythm, voices rising together in an uncanny harmony that made my chest tighten. The song wasn't simple. It was layered, almost dissonant, yet eerily compelling, like the forest itself had learned to sing. I froze behind a moss-covered boulder, trying to convince myself to leave, but my feet rooted in place. The figures didn't notice me at first. They were focused on their song, swaying slightly as though in a trance. Lantern light reflected off their faces, highlighting sharp cheekbones, eyes narrowed in concentration, hands twitching slightly in subtle gestures. It wasn't threatening, at least not yet, but it was wrong. Something about the precision, the unnatural unity of their movement, felt deeply unsettling. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, but it was drowned by the song that seemed to echo off the valley walls, circling me from every direction. Curiosity overcame caution. I leaned forward slightly to see better, and that's when I stepped on a dry branch. The sharp snap sliced through the song like a knife. Silence followed, so complete that it pressed against my eardrums and made the blood in my head thrum painfully. I froze, frozen mid-step, heart hammering. Slowly, impossibly slowly, every head turned toward me. Faces illuminated by the lanterns, eyes wide, fixed, calculating. Their gaze wasn't angry, not overtly, but it was assessing, patient, like they were weighing some verdict I could not comprehend. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots, twisting my ankle as I tried to retreat. The song didn't resume. It wasn't a song anymore, just the heavy silence of the valley, thick and suffocating. I scrambled over rocks, pushed through low-hanging branches, the undergrowth tearing at my clothes and skin. The figures didn't chase me, but I felt their presence pressing from the fog behind me. Every step I took seemed to pull me deeper into the hollow, even as I fought to run toward familiar landmarks. The melody I had heard, soft, disjointed, mesmerizing, lingered in my mind, embedding itself in my memory. I could hear it humming faintly in my ears long after the valley was out of sight. Finally, after what felt like hours though was likely minutes, I broke through the tree lane onto a ridge I recognized. My lungs burned, legs wobbled, but the relief was fleeting. Even here, far from the valley, I felt it, the faint tug of the hollow, a lingering pull that made my stomach twist. I told myself it was over, that the group, the song, the eyes were gone. But the memory clung to me, refusing to let go. I returned home that evening, trying to shake the experience. Friends asked how the hike went. I laughed it off, saying the fog made it tricky to navigate. But at night, when the world outside my window was quiet, I began to hear faint echoes of the song, drifting through my dreams. Sometimes I would wake humming the melody, the strange harmony threading itself through my mind, impossible to shake. The notes felt like a language I should never have understood, and yet they persisted, calling me back to the hollow. I've avoided Elder Hollow since that night, but I know it is still there watching. I can feel it in the quiet moments, the weight of eyes that might not even be human, the pull of the dissonant melody tugging at my memory. I try to fill my nights with light, with sound, with anything to drown the echo of that forbidden song. But some nights, when the wind moves through the trees just right, I swear I hear it faintly, carried on a whisper of mist. And I know, deep down, that it is waiting patient, just beyond the reach of sight, for the day I might be foolish enough to return. Even now, long after that hike, I wake in the middle of the night humming the song, feeling its rhythm pulse through me as though the hollow itself has marked me. I dream of the valley, of the choir kneeling in the fog, lanterns casting shadows over faces I cannot forget. Sometimes I wake, trembling, sensing the pull again, as if Elder Hollow is not a place I walked through once, but a presence that now follows me, threading its melody through my veins. I have tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the fog, an illusion born from exhaustion and isolation. But the feeling remains, the weight of unseen eyes, the echo of a song I should never have heard, and the relentless tug of the hollow. Some nights I can almost hear the lanterns flicker, see the figures shifting just at the edge of vision, and I know that no matter how far I go, no matter how carefully I avoid the valley, the choir is still out there, waiting, patient and eternal. Even now, when I step outside into misty air, I hesitate, thinking I catch a glimpse of candlelight glimmering through the fog, and I feel it, the silent evaluation, the pull of Elder Hollow calling me back. I try to look away, to convince myself I am imagining it, but the melody has planted itself too deeply. I can never unhear it, and I know in my bones that the hidden choir waits, patient, beyond the fog, waiting for the day I return. I was driving late one evening, winding along the narrow, twisting road that skirts the base of Widow's Peak. The sky had already begun to darken, streaks of crimson fading into deep indigo, and the wind carried a chill that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I wasn't supposed to be out this late, not on these back roads, but I needed to clear my mind. Work had been unbearable, and everything at home felt distant, suffocating. I kept the headlights low, trying not to disturb the quiet of the surrounding forest, when something caught my eye, a thin wisp of smoke curling lazily into the sky from somewhere beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it might be a campfire left unattended, a small comfort in the otherwise empty mountains. Curiosity, though, got the better of me, and I eased the car onto a faint dirt path that seemed to lead toward the smoke. The further I drove, the narrower the path became, flanked by towering pines whose trunks rose like the columns of some ancient cathedral. The forest was unnervingly still. Even the usual rustle of leaves and scurrying of small animals had vanished. The smoke, faint and gray, floated above the treetops, beckoning me deeper into the hollow. I told myself it was probably a group of campers, maybe a family or a small gathering of locals, and that I was being paranoid. But the stillness of the woods gnawed at me. The way shadows pooled under the trees and seemed to move just slightly when I glanced away. Eventually, the dirt track opened into a clearing. The fire sat at the center of a crude stone pit, flickering orange and red against the deepening darkness. Around it, hooded figures moved with deliberate care, arranging bones, herbs, and small objects into patterns I couldn't recognize. There was no chanting, no song, just the crackle of the flames and the occasional clink of something being set in place. I wanted to turn back, to drive away and never look again, but the ground under my feet felt heavier with each step, my body frozen by some strange inertia. It was like the clearing had claimed me, or maybe I had stumbled into a space that wasn't meant for outsiders. I crouched behind a fallen tree at the edge of the clearing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figures were silent, methodical, almost ritualistic in their movements. Bones were laid out in circles, herbs sprinkled along precise lines, and small symbols were etched into the dirt around the pit. I had no idea what it meant, and the uncertainty made my stomach turn. Something in the way they moved suggested purpose, devotion, and a knowledge older than anything I had ever encountered. I realized then that I was witnessing something private, something forbidden, and that my presence was not welcome. One of them stopped and raised their head. The hood fell back slightly, revealing a mask that covered half their face. Even through the disguise, I thought I saw recognition in their eyes. The feeling was immediate and visceral, a cold shiver crawling along my spine. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet had forgotten how to move. The world narrowed to that figure, the flames reflecting in their eyes, the meticulous arrangement of objects around the pit. Every instinct I had told me I had trespassed into something far beyond my comprehension, something that didn't like to be seen. The moment stretched, unbearable, until finally, my body remembered what it was for. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face, roots clawed at my boots, and the uneven ground tried to throw me off balance. I didn't look back, but I could feel them. The weight of their gaze pressed against my back as I fled, the smoke's acrid scent clinging to my hair and clothes. It followed me like a shadow, persistent and inescapable, infiltrating my senses even as the clearing receded into the trees behind me. When I finally reached the car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see hooded figures emerging from the tree lane, following me down the road. But the woods were silent again, the smoke a faint curl lost among the pines. I drove on, not stopping until the forest and its strange rituals were far behind me. Yet even days later, the smell of smoke seemed embedded in my skin. It lingered in my hair, on my clothes, clinging to me in ways that no shower or washing could erase. Sleep has never been easy since that night. When I close my eyes, I can still see the fire, the stone pit, the careful placement of bones and herbs, and the hooded figures frozen in time. Sometimes, in the quiet hours, I swear I hear the low hum of the ritual, a sound that rises and falls with my breathing, threading itself into my dreams. I wake suddenly, heart racing, certain that the clearing is out there waiting, that the figures are patient and deliberate, that the masked face I glimpsed knows I saw too much. I've tried to convince myself it was some strange local custom, a secretive group practicing an old form of devotion, but that explanation feels hollow. There was a presence there in that clearing that pressed against the edges of reality in ways I cannot articulate. The smoke, the scent, the meticulous movements of those figures. Everything was too precise, too purposeful to be random. I feel the memory like a weight pressing on my chest, a shadow of that night I can never shake, a pull that drags at the corners of my mind when I least expect it. Even now, driving past Widow's Peak, I find myself scanning the ridges, the tree lanes, looking for a curl of smoke, a flicker of flame. I tell myself it's foolish, that I am safe in my home, far from the hollow, far from the ritual. But deep down, I know it is still there. The clearing, the stone pit, the hooded figures, they wait, patient, silent, and when the wind carries the faintest trace of smoke, I can almost hear the low hum again, threading through the trees, a reminder that some places in the mountains do not forgive curiosity. I avoid those backroads now, the twists and turns that lead past Widow's Peak. But no matter how far I go, how much I tell myself the night was just a trick of the mind, I know the memory will never leave me. The ritual, the masked eyes, the smoke, they are part of me now. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind moves through the pines just so, I can still feel that presence, patient and deliberate, waiting for me to return. I remember the first time I crossed Old Hollow Bridge like it was yesterday, though it's been months now. The bridge itself was a rickety thing, wooden planks rotting with age, some warped, others missing entirely, held together by rusted nails that threatened to snap with each step. I had been hiking along a rarely used trail near the outskirts of town, following the river that wound lazily through the valley. The day had been warm, the late summer sun cutting through gaps in the forest canopy, painting the water below in sharp, shifting patterns of gold and green. I hadn't expected anything out of the ordinary, only the quiet solace of walking in the woods. But there's something about that bridge, about the way it hangs over the water like a fragile threshold, that I can't shake from my memory. As I stepped onto the bridge, each creak of the wood beneath my boots seemed amplified in the stillness of the forest. The river was slow-moving, its surface mirrored in the golden light, ripples dancing across moss-covered stones. I paused midway, leaning against the splintered railing, staring down at the water. That's when I saw movement. At first, it seemed like a trick of the reflection, shadows rippling beneath the water. But then the shapes took form. Figures kneeling along the riverbed and the banks beneath the bridge, their hands raised toward the wooden beams as if in reverence or supplication. They murmured words I couldn't understand, syllables that twisted unnervingly in the air, blending with the sound of the river until it seemed the water itself had taken on a voice. I froze, my stomach turning. The figures were dark, indistinct, cloaked by the rippling shadows of the trees and the bridge above, yet I could see enough to know they were human, or at least had been at some point. Their movements were deliberate, measured, almost ritualistic. I wanted to back away, to retreat, but my curiosity anchored me in place. The murmuring grew louder in my mind, though the forest remained silent, amplifying every heartbeat, every breath. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it, to see what they were doing. And that's when one of them looked up. Its head tilted slowly, and our eyes met. Even beneath the shadowed angles of the face, I could feel a recognition, a deliberate awareness that struck me colder than the river beneath. Time seemed to slow. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse hammering against my ribs. It wasn't anger, at least not the kind I expected. It was something older, patient, and deeply evaluating, as if it was weighing whether I belonged in that moment, in that space. The hair on the back of my neck rose, and I stumbled backward, my boots scraping against the worn wood of the bridge. The bridge groaned under my sudden movement, an ominous sound that made my stomach flip. Each step I took seemed precarious, the structure beneath me threatening to give way. Panic surged, and I broke into a sprint, the planks creaking violently under my weight. I dared a glance back and saw the figures shift in the shadows, their forms dissolving into the river and the trees as if the night itself swallowed them. Yet even as they vanished, the impression of their gaze lingered, etched deep into my mind. I reached the far end of the bridge and stumbled onto solid ground, lungs heaving, arms scraped from clutching at the railing, legs trembling from adrenaline. The forest around me seemed calm again, deceptively normal, but the memory of those kneeling shapes and the words they had murmured remained. I didn't speak to anyone that night, didn't even want to make the sound of my voice loud enough to disturb the quiet that seemed to hang like a veil over the bridge. The next day, I ran into locals while picking up supplies in the nearest town. They warned me immediately about Old Hollow Bridge, eyes narrowing, voices dropping to cautious murmurs. "Don't linger there after dark," one man said, shaking his head as though he'd seen too much himself. Others nodded silently, offering no further explanation. I didn't ask, though I already understood. It wasn't a story to tell lightly. That bridge held more than decaying wood and moss-covered beams. It held memory, patience, and something waiting for witnesses. Even weeks later, I would find myself driving past the bridge on familiar routes, stomach tightening as the treeline rose against the horizon. I couldn't look directly at it for long, afraid I'd see the shadows beneath again, those kneeling forms returning silently from the darkness, waiting. At night, in quiet moments when the world seemed to hold its breath, I swore I could hear the river itself carrying those murmurs, threaded through the sound of wind and leaves, echoing in the hollow spaces of my mind. The image haunts me, their hands raised toward the beams, the patient gaze from beneath the shadows, the sensation that they knew I had watched. There was no malice in the recognition, at least not in a way I could define. It was something older, something precise, like the forest itself had marked me, an unspoken invitation and warning woven into the creak of the wood and the murmur of the water. I tried to go back months later just to see if I had imagined it, to convince myself it was the play of light and shadow, a trick of nerves and isolation. But the road was empty, the bridge still rickety and foreboding, and I didn't dare cross. I could feel it even from the roadside, the presence beneath the beams, patient and deliberate, waiting. I turned around and left, knowing deep down that the bridge, the shadows, and the murmuring forms were not bound by my sight, that they would persist unhurried until the next witness appeared. I've since avoided that part of the trail entirely. Driving past Widow's Peak, I keep my eyes on the distant ridges, half expecting to glimpse movement beneath the trees, to see shapes bending and kneeling along the river, hands raised in silent devotion. The image is burned into me, and no amount of sunlight, no rational explanation, can erase it. I feel the presence still, a weight at the edge of awareness, patient, hungry for observation, for acknowledgement. And every time I pass near the hollow in the forest, my pulse quickens. I sense the bridge beneath the treeline, the shadows beneath, and the ritual continuing as it always has, unseen, patient, waiting for the next person to stumble across it and meet the gaze that pierces the darkness. Sometimes, at night, I dream of the bridge. The wooden planks stretch endlessly, warped and groaning beneath my weight. Below, the figures kneel in unbroken lines, whispering, hands raised, faces partially masked but alive with awareness. I step carefully, heart in my throat, knowing every step brings me closer to the river and the unknown. And though I wake with a jolt, safe in my bed, the echo of the murmuring persists. It threads through the wind outside my window, curls through the shadows in the corners of the room, and I know that patience is eternal. The shadows beneath Old Hollow Bridge remain, and one day they will see someone else, and I am left with the memory that I can never forget.